There's no I in Renga. Metaphorically, because, it's a collaborative art form where you have to put your individual ego aside to create the best work of art together as a team, but also literally because that's how it's spelled. And have I now over-explained the pun? I think I might have now over. Hello, you. I am Dr. Katie Ailes from I'm Lab Productions, and in today's workshop, I'm going to teach you how to write a Renga. This is a roughly 1,000-year-old poetic form from Japan in which multiple poets collaborate to create a single poem. It is a form rich with history, tradition, and nuance, and it is a wonderful opportunity to grab a few friends and get creative. Because of the collaborative nature of the Renga, this workshop is a little bit different from the rest of my Return to Form workshops. First, I'll introduce you to the Renga form, going over its history, its structure, and its traditions. I'll then give you some guidance on how to write it, including some advice on how to work together harmoniously as a group. We'll end by going over the basic step-by-step process, which should give you all the tools that you need to get going. Massive thanks, as always, to the National Lottery through Creative Scotland for making the Return to Form project possible. You can check out all of the videos in this series through the link up there in the eye. Before we dive in here, because this workshop is aimed towards English speakers who are seeking to write Renga in English, which is a very different language and literary culture from the Japanese literary culture from which Renga emerged, let's begin with a quick disclaimer. As I'll detail soon, there are several elements of the Renga, most notably the line length, that are very different in English and Japanese because of the differences in our languages. And because of these differences, some have argued that trying to write Renga in English is pointless, because it'll never be exactly the same thing in English as it is in Japanese. That's a kind of a bummer of a thought, so why carry forward with this workshop? My philosophy, and it's just mine, yours may be different, is that when we learn about artistic forms from other cultures, it's important to respect that, the translation process, the adaptation process will yield a different result. English language Renga won't be exactly the same as Japanese Renga, and that's just what it is. But from there, it's whether you believe, okay, well, let's just not bother with it, or whether you think that maybe a bit of inspiration and meaning and beauty and a kernel of the original purpose can still be found in this new version of the form. In my opinion, as long as you respect the originating literary culture, you take the time to understand what the form means in that culture, and you appreciate that there will be differences due to language differences, it can be so valuable to translate a literary form, a poetic form, into a new language and a new literary culture, as we're doing here. So in today's workshop, we're going to explore the history, the traditions, and the contemporary use of the Renga in Japan, and we're going to consider how it's been adapted into English language literary traditions. All of that will give you the understanding that you need to write beautiful Renga yourself. And by yourself, I mean with other people. All right, let's go for it. So what is a Renga? The Renga is a Japanese poetic form dating back roughly 1,000 years, depending on the way that you count it out. It is a collaborative form, so multiple poets contribute stanzas to the same Renga. If one person writes the entire poem, it is not a Renga. Structurally, the Renga consists of alternating haiku and couplets, and each author only contributes one stanza at a time. It is an open poetic form, which means that it's not limited to, say, 20 stanzas long. A Renga can go on for as long as you like, as long as you continue to follow the rules of the form. And traditionally, a Renga addresses certain themes in a certain way, chiefly nature and seasons. I'm going to go into detail about all of these elements shortly. The history of the Renga is complicated and fascinating and centuries long, but to very briefly skim the surface, way back in the 7th century, Japanese poets developed the form of the tanka, which is a 5-line long poem with the syllable count 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. The tanka was later renamed the waka and then back to the tanka, and it remains a popular form in contemporary Japanese poetry. Over the next couple hundred years, a practice developed of collaboratively writing tanka, with one poet writing the first stanza and another poet writing the second stanza. These poems became known as ten renga, or short renga. Eventually, poets began collaborating further and developing longer versions of these, continuing the tanka pattern. 575, 77, 575, 77, etc. In the 1400s, this form really hit its heyday, and court poets developed specific rules for the form, effectively codifying it and establishing what we now know today as Renga. Over the centuries, there have been many versions of Renga, such as the Hakai no Renga, which is a comic Renga. There are also specific terms for renga of certain lengths. These include the nijuin, which is a renga of 20 stanzas, the kasen, 36 stanzas, and the hyakuin, which is 100 stanzas. A final interesting bit of trivia. So the first stanza of a tanka, and by extension of a renga, that 575 stanza, is called a hokku. It was centuries before poets started writing just that stanza on its own outside the context of the tanka and the renga, and started calling it, you guessed it, a haiku. Of course, now the haiku has become much more popular globally than the forms that it came from. Cool bit of trivia to whip out at your next party, 'cause you're cool. And guys, I have researched how to pronounce all of these names and I've tried my very best, but obviously not a native Japanese speaker, so I do sincerely apologize for any pronunciation mistakes that I'm making here. So that's the very condensed potted history of the Renga. I have just skimmed the surface, but I have linked below to a few resources in the description if you want to learn more. All right, so let's start actually breaking down how the Renga works in more detail. As I noted, there are several elements, both structural and in terms of content. Like many ancient poetic forms, over the centuries, Renga has accumulated a lot of rules and traditions to follow. Like, you must mention a flower in the penultimate stanza of a 20-stanza long Renga. A lot. Many of these specific rules were added by court poets in the 1400s, and some scholars have actually said that they hampered the form. They restricted it too much, kind of over-regulated it, so that it became difficult for poets to write fresh, compelling Renga with all of these rules. Some poets writing Renga today will compose using all of these exact traditional requirements, but some poets will simply adhere to the broad spirit of the Renga. In this workshop, we're finding a balance between the two. I'll point out the traditional rules, and again, I've linked to resources in the description below if you want to follow them to the letter of the law. But I'll also distill it down and I'll emphasize the really core facets, the heart of the Renga, so that if you don't want to follow each of the traditions, you can simply write a Renga which follows the spirit of the form. Let's begin by going over the structure, and I'll show you how it works using one of the Renga composed for this season of Return to Form. We commissioned 3 brilliant Scotland-based poets, Beck Sherwood, Imogen Sterling, and Kate Tuch, to collaborate on 3 separate Renga. You can see their gorgeous and poignant work through the video linked up there in the eye. Here, I'll break down the structure using the first 4 stanzas of the Renga composed by Kate Tuch and Imogen Sterling, entitled Days. So, Renga consist of alternating hokku, which you probably know as haiku, so that's what I'll call them from now on, and couplets. The haiku is a stanza consisting of 3 lines. The first is 5 syllables, the second 7 syllables, and the third 5 syllables. You can count that out on the first stanza here. So, skittery crane flies, 5, legs searching the closed walls at, 7, lights out, hobbling, sleep, 5. The couplet is a 2-line stanza where each line is 7 syllables. So here, its drone finds harmony with 7, clock ticks, sleepless symphony 7. And these haiku and couplets alternate until the poets determine that the renga is over. Again, there's no set length. Nice and simple. But as I mentioned before, there's a few translation wrinkles in here that I will very briefly explain. So in English here, we are counting syllables. 575, 77, etc. In Japanese, though, the sound unit, called an on, is quite different from the English syllable. Without going too far into the weeds of linguistics, basically English is a stress-timed language and Japanese is a mora-timed language. And mora are similar to, but not the same as English syllables. What all of this basically boils down to is that in original Japanese language renga and tanka and haiku, there are usually far fewer words per line than in their English language counterparts. So what do we do with all these differences? Some English language poets will still stick to that 57577 rule. It isn't a perfect translation because the sound units are different in each language, but it's what we got. Other poets will simply adhere to the principle at play here, which is brevity. So you might decide not to count syllables, but simply to keep your lines short and choose each word carefully. Poets of renown have done both, counting syllables or not. It is up to you which strategy you choose. Alrighty, moving on from structure, let's look at some of the traditional content that you want to write about in a renga. Traditionally, renga make reference to the natural world. They are set in nature rather than in man-made environments. There are also certain symbols, certain images from nature that are traditionally alluded to at certain points, including the moon and flowers. Although contemporary renga generally all do carry on this natural world focus of the renga, there is some flexibility here. First, the natural environment of Japan described in classical renga, so the image of the cherry blossom or snow-capped mountains, may not be anything like your natural surroundings right now. You don't need to write about Japanese nature, and in fact, you really shouldn't. Focus on your own environment. So for me, living in Edinburgh, my renga might mention the gorse bushes or blackberry bushes, the hills, the constant rain. And because I live in a city, my renga might also mention some man-made structures because they are a core part of my environment, like the tenements or church spires or the docks in Leith. Returning briefly to Kate Tuch and Imogen Sterling's renga, they beautifully describe the intertwining of natural and man-made in their poem, specifically how insects coexist with us in our homes. And in my opinion, this is a wonderful example of how contemporary renga can maintain the tradition of focusing on natural elements while still being relevant to poets who may not be out in full-blown quote-unquote nature all of the time. Another way in which renga focus on the natural world is by referencing seasons. Traditionally, the opening haiku of a renga references the season in which the renga is being written. So if you're writing the renga in January, your opening haiku might mention the word winter or might make reference to snowfall. In classic renga, you include every season of the year at some point throughout the renga, and generally you end on a spring verse. Again here, you might decide to soften this requirement, and instead of mentioning every season throughout the renga, you might instead use a gentle focus on the passage of time. Our three poets writing renga for the season of return to form did this by using the roughed prompts of days, months, and years for each of their renga. A final note on time here. So traditionally renga are written in present tense. They're situated in the here and now, in presence. This immediacy, this nowness is central to the idea of Renga, so it's really not the place for recounting old memories, for example. It's really about presence now. The last main content element of Renga is that somewhere over the course of classic Renga, they address the theme of love. This reference doesn't need to occur in any particular part of the Renga, and it definitely doesn't need to occupy the whole poem. It's just something to bring up at some point. As with the other traditional elements of the form, it's up to you the extent to which you use it in your Renga. A final core aspect of composing Renga is the strategy of link and shift. Here I'm borrowing the terms of Martin Lewis of the British Haiku Society. He wrote a really helpful guide to the Renga for English language writers, and I have linked it in the description below. Basically, this principle of link and shift is about balancing connecting each new stanza with the one that came before it, but also progressing the poem forwards. And the specific technique that you use here in Renga may seem a little bit strange to you. Usually, in English language literary traditions, when we sit down to write a poem, we sit down to write one sole cohesive thing, where the beginning and the end are somehow connected. In Renga, though, when you are writing a new stanza to add to the collaborative poem, you only want your new stanza to link to the stanza that comes immediately before it. You're not thinking about the trajectory of the poem as a whole, where it goes from beginning to end, any kind of narrative or emotional arc, any kind of cohesion, none of that. You are just thinking about how to engage with and progress from that last stanza. In case this is a helpful comparison to you, I think of composing Renga kind of like playing the writing game Exquisite Corpse. In that game, there's a single sheet of paper that's passed around a group of writers. The first writer starts it off with the first line, then passes it to the second writer. The second writer writes the second line and then folds the top bit of the paper down and passes it to the third writer so that the third writer can only see the second line and respond to that line. The third writer then has to continue the story without knowing what came before in the first line. The results are often wild and unexpected. It's a great way to break out of writer's block and really get creative. A similar premise is at work in the Renga, so it's moment to moment, stanza to stanza. Only the last stanza matters when you're composing the next stanza. All right, so hopefully all of that context and background and information gave you a solid understanding of how Renga work. So how do you actually go about writing one? In this final part of the workshop, I will break down step by step how to actually write your Renga, including gathering folks, coordinating the writing, to actually getting it down on paper, to editing it and sharing it. The first step, of course, is to gather your group of Renga writers. Poets, assemble! This can be as little as just 2 people, just you and a pal, or as many people as you want to get involved. The only limit, really, is how many people you feel like you can comfortably organize to actually write this poem, which leads to the next step, coordinating your writing plan. First, is your group going to gather in person to write your Renga? You could set aside an afternoon or an entire day or week to develop the poem together. Or, especially if there's distance or public health regulations between you, you could use the magic of dem old internets to write your Renga online. You could set up an email chain or a shared Google Doc or even go back and forth using text. Lots of options here. Another important aspect to plan up front is coordinating the order in which the poets will contribute stanzas. So, for example here, let's say that the entire I Am Loud team is writing a Renga together. So there are 5 of us, me, Kev, Mark, Perry, Bex. Do you always want to contribute stanzas in the same order? So Katie, Kev, Mark, Perry, Bex, Katie, Kev, Mark, Perry, Bex, etc., etc.? If you're doing this approach, make sure that you have an odd number of participants. Otherwise, the same people will always end up writing haiku, and the same people will always end up writing couplets. I mean, if everyone's cool with that, that's all groovy, but it's something to be aware of when you're coordinating your writing plan. Another strategy here is that everyone writes a stanza every single time, and then one person, or collectively the group, chooses which stanza gets added to the shared poem. This strategy is more time and work intensive because it means that everyone is writing every single stanza. It also means that every time some stanzas won't get chosen, and they'll be sort of relinquished to the recycling bin of the poem. If you're rolling with this approach, just make sure that everyone is cool with it, because obviously it means doing a lot of writing that won't actually end up going into the shared poem. You just gotta roll with it. In this strategy, you also need to figure out how the group will decide which stanzas are chosen to go into the shared Renga. You could do this by vote. Everyone gets to vote on which stanza they think is the best one to carry forward the poem. Obviously, just make sure that everyone isn't just voting for their own stanza. You could also choose a leader who will always make the decision of which stanza goes in and who understands the form of the Renga and will carry out their duties decisively but kindly. Whichever approach you use here, either a set order or everyone writing every time, it's totally groovy. Just decide up front and make sure that everyone is cool with the plan. And just as important as working out the logistics of how your group will write the Renga is figuring out which elements of the Renga you'll be following. How closely will you be adhering to tradition here? Will the stanzas need to follow the syllable count of 57577, or will you simply prioritize brevity without sweating the syllable count? Will you need to mention every season in the Renga, or will you simply have an emphasis on the passage of time? How about referencing certain natural images, such as the moon and flowers? Again, just ensure that everyone's on the same page here, because if some people want to go hardcore and follow the letter of the law of classic Renga traditions, and others just sort of want to be looser and follow the spirit, things can get a little bit awkward, so just make a plan and stick to it. And at this point, you may also want to decide up front whether you want to cap your Renga at a certain number of stanzas, 20 stanzas, 100 stanzas, whether you only want to write for a certain amount of time, so however many stanzas you get to in an afternoon, or whether you're just gonna let it roll on indefinitely. After all of that planning, you actually get to it. The next step is to begin by writing the first stanza. If you're using a set order, then just begin with the first person in that order. But if you're not using a set order and everyone is writing every time and you've appointed a leader who will choose the stanzas that go into the poem, usually that leader writes the first stanza. And as I'd mentioned, traditionally the first stanza references the season in which you're writing the poem. Again, up to you how closely you follow that. Once that first stanza is written, you just keep rolling on from there, following the strategies that you set out at the beginning. However religiously you're adhering to the traditions of the form, the core components of Renga to keep in mind as you're composing are brevity, so either following the 57577 syllable count or simply keeping your lines as concise as possible. Link and shift, so engaging only with the previous stanza and progressing forward from it. And presence in time and place, whether that means using all of the traditional seasonal and natural references or simply bringing an awareness of your surroundings to the poem. The final step of writing any poem is to edit it and then share it. Because of the collaborative nature of a Renga and the fact that it's been very carefully crafted stanza by stanza, generally you want to use a pretty light touch on the editing. You definitely don't want to cut out stanzas or rearrange them, since that would ruin the link and shift, the internal logic of the poem. All that I would suggest doing when editing your Renga is checking over the grammar and maybe making the punctuation consistent across the entire poem so that it's easy to read. But really, that's all you need to do. And once that's done, you're ready to share it. When publishing Renga, traditionally you want to list all of the contributing writers' names after the Renga as the authors. It's up to you whether you also want to credit each individual stanza to the poet who wrote it, but I would actually recommend against that. Part of the spirit of the Renga is collective authorship, communal creativity. It really values the group over the individual. There's something really beautiful about letting individual attribution and, frankly, ego melt away here. It doesn't matter who wrote which bit. We all wrote the poem together. And on that lovely note, guys, we will leave it there. That is all of my guidance on the Renga given. I know that that was a ton of information and context and guidance, but I really, really hope that this workshop was helpful to you in understanding how the Renga works, situating it in its massive, broad context, and understanding how to coordinate and write one. And if this has inspired you to get together with folks and write one, first of all, best of luck. I hope that it goes wonderfully. And secondly, I would love to read it when you've wrapped it up. As always, you can pop poems in the comments or share them with us on social media. All of our handles are in the video description. And of course, if you have any questions at all about writing Renga, please ask away in the comments. I'm more than happy to help. Guys, we're nearly at the end of this season of Return to Form. We only have one poetic form remaining, and that is Standard Habbie, a traditional Scottish form also known as the Burns stanza. Mark Grist and Angie Strachan have written witty and hilarious poems in Standard Habbie for us, and of course, I will have a workshop all about that form, so stay tuned. The easiest way to stay tuned is by subscribing to the channel and ringing that bell icon while you're at it so that you get notified every time that we post new videos. If you like this video, please do consider giving it a like and letting us know in the comments. It really does help us be able to make more of these videos. You can also directly support what we do here at I Am Loud and receive so many awesome perks by signing up to our Patreon for as little as £1 a month. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and happy writing.